Good morning. Welcome to Promoting Equity, a look at how the governor's budget measures up. I'm Michelle Mackey, CEO of Kids Forward, home to the Wisconsin Budget Project and the Race to Equity Initiative. Before we begin, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge last night's shooting in Atlanta. Horrific violence against Asian American women, many of whom were at work trying to care for their families. And yet another mass shooting in our nation that appears to be based in white supremacist ideology. As we go through today, you'll hear us talk a bit about the realities for children and families of color. And so do hold the folks of Atlanta, the Asian American community in your hearts and minds as we talk and have these conversations about Wisconsin and our future today. We at Kids Forward, we're a 140-year-old policy center, and we advocate for Wisconsin children and families, especially children and families of color, and those furthest from opportunity. We thank you for joining us today for this important conversation. And even with the tragedy in Atlanta, we know that on this St. Patrick's Day, there are signs of hope. We've had a great year of challenge. A year ago, we all entered lockdown, not knowing that we would face the entwined crises of raging pandemic, economic recession, racial reckoning, and an assault on our democratic institutions. And as our history shows us time and time again, children, families, and communities bore a greater burden as our state and nation struggled. We saw early in the pandemic that Wisconsin's Indigenous communities experienced COVID death rates at nearly 3 times higher than white residents. The Latinx community experienced COVID death rates 2.6 times higher, Black residents 2.2 times higher, and Asian and Pacific Islander residents 1.6 times higher. While essential workers of color kept us fed and our communities running, 64% of Black families and 71% of Latinx families suffered a loss of income last year, compared to a state rate of 51% and a national rate of 56%. This comes as no surprise. We've known that systemic racism not only exists throughout our institutions, policies, and structures, but it acts much like COVID. It destroys their effectiveness and viability from within. The healthcare system continues to fail communities of color with egregiously disparate rates of vaccination in this state. Wisconsin's unemployment insurance system, weakened by unfounded fears of a racist stereotype of the Black welfare queen, collapsed, unable to get money to families across the state last year. We appreciate the Evers administration's intentional and targeted attention to the needs of Wisconsin's children, families, and communities, especially those of color. The governor's budget proposal does not avoid reality. With a balance of $1.3 billion to carry over into the 2021-23 biennium, after a $540 million tax cut for Wisconsinites at the end of last year, the budget proposal does not fall for the myth that austerity will help Wisconsin recover from the pandemic. And it does not ignore that time and time again, Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other communities of color are the last to benefit from economic recovery. It acknowledges that a return to normal for children and families of color is a return and perpetuation of the nation's most egregious racial disparities that we have in this state, Wisconsin. In just a moment, my colleagues will tell you more about what is in the governor's budget. Then we'll have a facilitated conversation with 3 leaders about what the budget proposals mean for Wisconsin's communities of color. Thank you. Alder JoCasta Zamarripa from Milwaukee, Delechia Johnston from the Wisconsin Alliance for Infant Mental Health, and Lisa Peyton-Caire from the Foundation for Black Women's Wellness for what will no doubt be an insightful conversation. Finally, I will return to tell you a bit about how you can get involved and how you can express your support for long overdue investments to remedy racial inequality and injustice in Wisconsin. Thank you. And now my friend and colleague, John Peacock, the Wisconsin Budget Project Director, will lead the discussion of equity in the budget. John, you're on mute.
Okay, somebody had to do that. So it's fitting that I would be the one. I'm John Peacock, technologically inept, but yet the policy director at Kids Forward. And for the past 22 years, I've headed up the Wisconsin Budget Project here at Kids Forward. We decided to start this presentation, this summary of the budget with a slide about taxes, because Wisconsin's tax system provides a very good illustration of how racism can be embedded into state policy. Wisconsin's tax code never mentions race, but it penalizes people of color in our state in a number of different ways. One of those ways is that our state, to a greater extent than most other states, provides substantial tax breaks for homeowners that aren't available for renters. And our state taxes wages at a higher rate than income earned from wealth. And those are particularly important policy choices, because people of color nationally typically have about 1/10, or Blacks typically have about 1/10 the wealth of white Americans. And because of the long history of housing discrimination, people of color are far less apt to be homeowners. The governor's budget takes some important steps towards making the tax code a bit less slanted against low-income Wisconsinites and people of color. One way that it does that is by increasing the homestead credit. The homestead credit's the most important source of property tax relief for low-income renters in our state. And it's a program that over the past 10 years, as the majority party was substantially increasing tax breaks for homeowners, they cut in half the homestead tax credit program. The governor's budget also increases the earned income tax credit, which helps make work pay for parents in low-wage jobs. And perhaps equally important, the governor's budget closes several tax loopholes that primarily benefit the very wealthy in our state. One example of that is that it narrows the current tax preference for capital gains income, for specifically narrowing that for the highest income Wisconsinites. By narrowing those tax loopholes, the governor's budget not only creates a more level playing field on taxes, it also generates revenue that's very needed to make state investments that will help people of color in Wisconsin. Turning to the next slide relating to healthcare, I want to start by noting that Wisconsin has some of the worst racial disparities in health outcomes. For example, our state's Black infant and maternal health disparities are among the worst in the nation. Further, despite the fact that we've made some progress after implementing the Affordable Care Act, Wisconsin still has wide racial disparities in who has access to affordable health insurance. The governor has proposed a very broad agenda, and I think a strong agenda in healthcare. And you can see a full summary of that prepared by my colleague, William Park Sutherland, on our website. But I'm going to hit just a few highlights of that agenda. The key part of the health care budget is the expansion of Badger Care, which would cover nearly 91,000 additional Wisconsinites. And yet, even while covering more people, that would save more than $300 million a year by qualifying Wisconsin for a higher federal matching rate on our Medicaid program. those savings would enable the state to make significant investments in healthcare, including investments to promote racial equity. Some examples of those investments come in the area of improving maternal and child health. And along those lines, the budget includes $8 million in grants to organizations working to reduce disparities related to maternal and infant mortality. And some of that funding would be directly allocated to Black women-led organizations to improve Black women's health and wellness. Another important part of the agenda for improving maternal and infant health is $21 million to expand postpartum coverage for women. It's currently just 2 months, and the budget bill would expand that to 1 year to help ensure continuity of care for both mom and baby. And then the last point I want to cover is that there's several significant initiatives in the budget aimed at reducing and treating lead poisoning in children, a condition that disproportionately harms Black children in Wisconsin. One of those initiatives is a $40 million investment to safely renovate lead-based water service lines, and the governor also proposes additional funding to support treatment for more children who've been exposed to lead. And I'll stop there, and we'll go to the next slide, which Didit's going to take.
Good morning. My name is Delechia, and I'm a policy and outreach specialist at Kids Forward. One of my focus areas is early care and education. So whether due to high costs, limited availability, or inconvenient program hours, childcare challenges are driving parents out of the workforce. And mothers disproportionately take more caregiving responsibility when their family cannot secure childcare. So from a racial equity lens, investing on ECE which is early care and education, is so much more than working better with children of color. It is also ensuring that support for families, women of color, are available as they are carrying Wisconsin's youngest populations. Before we go into the key budget priorities, let's recognize that this budget is the first substantial investment the state of Wisconsin has ever made in decades using state tax dollar on childcare, totaling $106 million. The legislative may not pass, let's recognize that too, but it is also important that the governor shows us leadership. Let's celebrate that, and that we want to support him in this process. So let's move on to the key budget priorities. The investment on early childhood social and emotional learning. This is to support both children and educators in responding to how they have all been impacted by racism and systemic oppression. With children, we're talking about trauma, or some of you may know adverse childhood experiences that disproportionately affecting kids of color more than white kids. This investment could help establish nurturing and consistent relationships within the context of family, community, and culture in our ECE systems. The next is about the 53206 zip code area ECE initiative. The zip code area is a heavily African-American neighborhood that has suffered from all manners of ills, poverty, incarceration, including access to quality childcare. So the ECE initiative from the 2019-2020 budget has helped make childcare a little more affordable. The ECE workforce has more professional development opportunities with Milwaukee Area Technical College. And ECE programs have more access to various technical consultation to increase the quality of their childcare environment. This expansion means implementing this model that is built on one of the most challenging areas to other similar complex neighborhoods. The next is the investment on reward program that is to provide salary supplements to eligible childcare professionals for 6 months period and can be renewed. ECE workforce remains the lowest paid educators, with a significant ECE workforce is low-income women and of color. This is to help provide a little better pay for them. I said a little better because among ECE professionals and advocates, at least we need 10 times bigger than what is made available currently. But this is a good start. Lastly, allowing individuals to use family leave so they could care for their children when childcare provider is closed. Remember, I stated earlier that mothers disproportionately take on caregiving responsibility when their family cannot find or afford childcare. This is one way to critically address that, so that again, when the childcare closes, they have a solution to take care of their children without sacrificing their work. I'm gonna pass on to Erica, who is going to talk about emerging adults.
All right, good morning. I am Erica Nelson, and I'm the Advocacy Director at Kids Forward, and I'm here just to take a few minutes to talk about one of the areas in the budget that targets the deep end systems like juvenile justice. So Wisconsin has some of the highest racial disparities in the juvenile justice system in the country, and notably the highest rate of incarceration for Black men in the nation. Black youth are 15 times more likely to be involved in the system, and Native American youth 9 times as compared to their white peers. In addition, Wisconsin lags woefully behind other states in raising the age for adult jurisdiction from the age of 17 to 18 or above. Wisconsin remains only one of 3 states where 17-year-olds are in the adult system. The other 2 states are Texas and Georgia. So structural and systemic racism over countless decades has disproportionately impacted youth of color. They're more likely to be subject to juvenile justice involvement because of the presence of disparities in law enforcement. There are disparities in arrest, there are disparities for prosecutions of violent crime, and of course there's general bias in the system itself from both judges and social workers, and there's also over policing of neighborhoods. As a consequence of all of this, there's a disproportionate number of youth of color in the system. And while the overall number of youth in the state of Wisconsin has been going down, there's been an increase in actual disparities. So the Evers administration recognizes the need to address these disparities in the juvenile justice system and have proposed many things in the state budget. However, these are some of the key highlights that we think get at some of the disparities. So raising the age from 17 to 18 for all youth with no carve-outs, and then modifying the conditions under which a youth under the age of 18 may be waived into adult court. Secondly, closing Lincoln Hills and Copper Lake, which are the secure facilities for youth. Currently, there's only 60 boys and 5 girls in Lincoln Hills, and almost 80% of those are kids of color. In 2019, Lincoln Hills was ordered closed because of violations of youth civil rights with restraints and the use of pepper spray. So really it's been delayed, and Lincoln Hills and Copper Lake need to be closed. We need to put kids in, our efforts need to be directed towards providing services for those kids, and especially meet the mental health needs of these youth. Many of the youth that are in Lincoln Hills and Copper Lake right now are there because there's nowhere else, no other place to send them that can meet their mental health needs. And you know, they're far from home and in a facility that they don't need to be in. Next, we need to increase the minimum age of delinquency from 10 years old to 12. This takes into consideration brain development. Moreover, it reflects a more humane, child-focused system that addresses the child's needs by considering the compounding trauma of putting a 10-year-old or a child in a detention center. We need to also, as the budget proposes, eliminate the use of detention for youth who have violated a court order for having committed a status offense. Status offenses shouldn't land youth back in detention. This impacts youth disproportionately of color from many who may not have the resources to meet their dispositional orders. And as a consequence are also seen being subject to racial bias by judges as well as caseworkers when they are allegedly violating their orders. And then the budget has an increase in investment in community-based services to respond to youth's needs. And this is an investment in youth aids for counties to cover the costs of implementing best practices for support services for youth. These two ones that I've just mentioned are invest in prevention and invest in best practices for supporting youth. It meets them where they are at, and it diverts them from further involvement in the system, thus reducing disparities by reducing the number of youth of color. And community-based programs really reflect those youth needs best. So there are a myriad of different things in the state budget around juvenile justice that can reduce disparities. These are some of the pressing and we believe, many of the very impactful ones. So we look forward to seeing what happens. All right. I'm moving on to my colleague Tamarine, who's going to be discussing education in the budget.
Thanks, Erica. I'm Tamarine Cornelius, and I'm an analyst at Kids Forward that focuses on tax and budget policy. The state spends more tax money on K-12 education than on anything else. And so we should make sure that the state spends this money in a way that addresses systemic racism in our schools and moves us closer to providing equitable opportunities for students of color. And there's several things in the budget that gets us going in that direction. One is more resources for students with low incomes. In Wisconsin, schools are funded through a complex stream of both local property tax and state resources. And the state part is calculated based on the number of students in the district and also on the characteristics of the students and of the characteristics of the district. And the governor is proposing a new payment to districts of $75 per student for students from families with low income. So this would add up to about $28 million a year. And this promotes racial equity because due to things like longstanding employment discrimination and unequal opportunities in housing and education, families of color are more likely to struggle to make ends meet. And this provision would direct more money to schools to help schools move towards meeting those kids and those families' needs. Another item in the budget proposal is new resources for driver's ed. So it used to be that high schools offer driver's ed, and there used to be a dedicated stream of funding from the state for this. That's not how it is now. Most schools don't offer driver's ed after years of budget cuts, and the state doesn't offer specific resources. And kids have to take a certified driver's education class. I just signed my daughter up last week and it was $600, which puts that out of reach for a lot of families that are struggling to make ends meet. And the governor's budget includes $3 million a year starting the second year for kids with low incomes to get driver's education. The budget also includes more money for students who are learning English, $28 million over 2 years. And it also expands the pool of school districts that can get that money. It used to be basically just the biggest districts could get that money, and now more school districts can get it, and it's a bigger pool of resources. Most of the students who are learning English, their first language is either Spanish or Hmong, and so these students are mostly drawn from a population of students of color. There's also a small bit in the budget that gives grants to school districts to help them get their staff credentialed as teachers of English language learners. Another item is for higher education. The governor's budget would give in-state tuition rates to students who graduate from Wisconsin high schools and would be eligible for in-state tuition, except that they aren't documented. About 3/4 of the Wisconsin population that isn't documented come from either Mexico or Central America. So again, this is a population that's mostly of color. And we've touched on some major categories here in terms of things in the budget, but there are other things in the budget as well outside of the areas that we talked about. So this is by no means a comprehensive description of all the things in the governor's budget that would promote racial equity, because there's a lot in there. And but there are a few more things that didn't fit neatly into those other categories that are worth us highlighting. And one of them is removing the barriers to driver's licenses for people who are undocumented. So some states allow people who don't have documentation to get driver's licenses, but Wisconsin does not. So if we did this, then we estimate 32,000 people in Wisconsin would get driver's licenses, and 14,000 of those people live with kids. So this would really promote family well-being. Another provision is legalization of marijuana, taxing it, and then reinvesting those resources or part of those resources back in communities that have been harmed by the state's policy of incarceration. Blacks and whites use marijuana at comparable rates, but Black people are far, far more likely to be prosecuted for marijuana-related offenses than white people are. Another item is increase in emergency assistance. So families with low income and who have kids can get emergency assistance support for housing or housing related expenses that help them stay in their homes. The governor's budget includes $8 million, additional $8 million, so more people can qualify for help. Families can get larger grants, and then it also changes it so that people during times of emergency, families don't actually have to be on the cusp of being evicted before they can get help. Another item is that the governor is designating equity officers at all the major state agencies, and it'll be the responsibility of that equity officer to determine how state policies affect people of color and also people with disabilities. And then the last thing to touch on is that there's a number of changes in the adult corrections area that would promote racial equity. So some of the changes are that it would invest additional resources in helping divert people from prison, in giving them alternatives and giving them the treatment they need. Once people are incarcerated, it would expand options that allow them to serve part of their sentence in the community rather than being locked up. And then after their incarceration, when they're on supervision, it would make it harder for the state to send people back to prison who haven't been convicted of new crimes. Thanks for being part of this component of the presentation. Now I'm going to hand it over to William to start off the panelist discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Tamarine. Thanks, Michelle, for setting the stage for us. And thanks to the rest of our team for giving us a deeper dive into some of the budget items that could have a positive impact toward racial equity. We're now very fortunate to be joined by three amazing leaders who will offer their perspective and expertise on aspects of the governor's proposed budget, what's at stake, and what else needs to happen. Before we get to the panelists, I want to offer one observation about why these conversations are so important. I recently heard an interview with Heather McGee discussing her new book, The Sum of Us, about the cost of American racism for everyone. In the interview, she talked about how the need to understand the impact of racism throughout history. She offered that it was necessary to have a clear grasp of US history, that without it, your understanding is at best incomplete, most likely incorrect. I suggest the same thing is true for the budget. If we don't use a racial equity lens, if our analysis isn't informed by an understanding of race and racism, at best, we have an incomplete picture of the budget. Racial equity is not an add-on, it's a necessity to fully understand the what, how, and why of the state budget. So let's jump into this discussion with our fantastic panelists to get a more complete picture of the impact of the budget in Wisconsin. JoCasta Zamarripa is an alderperson for the city of Milwaukee. She has been a strong advocate for an equitable Wisconsin and active supporter of pro-immigrant policies at the state level, such as access to driver's licenses for all and tuition equity for Wisconsin Dreamers. Delechia Johnson is with the Wisconsin Alliance for Infant Mental Health. She has vast experience with early childhood professionals, children, and families, which has made her a sought-after trainer in developing equitable early childhood practices. Last but not least, Lisa Peyton-Caire is the founding CEO and president of the Foundation for Black Women's Wellness, an organization that works to eliminate health disparities and other barriers impacting Black women and their families and communities. So please share, we can just go around, whoever wants to go first. Please share a little more about yourself if you'd like, and tell us briefly how the state budget impacts your work and your advocacy efforts.
All right, you want me to, I'll go first. I'm Alderwoman JoCasta Zamarripa. Thank you so much to Kids Forward for including me in this panel discussion. Although I'm no longer in the state legislature, I worked for many years with Kids Forward and appreciated their insight on policy. I'm so happy to be here today to discuss Governor Tony Evers' budget, and in particular how it affects people of color in the state of Wisconsin. I served almost my entire tenure in the legislature under a Republican governor and a Republican controlled legislature, and saw firsthand some of the detrimental effects of their budgets over the years. And so I can tell you again firsthand what it feels like to have a governor who stands with Black and brown Wisconsinites. And I believe that this budget reflects that. We heard that just moments ago from the various members of the Kids Forward team. My commitment in particular as a Latina Wisconsinite, as the grandchild of immigrants, as somebody who represents a district that has a strong immigrant history, I've been an advocate for pro-immigration policy, immigration reform, things like driver's licenses for undocumented Wisconsinites that Governor Evers has put in his budget, which is unprecedented for a Wisconsin governor to do so, by the way. Things like in-state tuition for Wisconsin Dreamers, and the many other components that I know we're going to discuss today. But with that, I want to allow my fellow panelists to introduce themselves as well. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I'm not sure if we were going in the order we were introduced, but I'm happy to go. Lisa Peyton-Caire, founder, CEO, and president of the Foundation for Black Women's Wellness. First saying thank you to Kids Forward for this forum and for recognizing the work of us panelists as part of the ecosystem in Wisconsin that is working to drive health equity from many different vantage points. Our organization, the Foundation for Black Women's Wellness, based in Dane County, exists for the singular purpose of eliminating health disparities and other barriers impacting Black women and girls. And we've been doing this work since 2012 and really deeply understand from a personal community perspective how critical this budget really is for the women and communities we serve and for all of Wisconsin. A racial equity lens has shaped this budget, which, as my colleague said, JoCasta said initially, is unprecedented for Wisconsin, given the history that we know and leadership over the years. There has not been that focus and that commitment to name racial equity and inequality as a deep root cause of the inequities we continuously and persistently face in our state. We know from the lens of Black women's health that Wisconsin is first and worst in the nation for racial health disparities, racial birth disparities, and that happens in a backdrop of first and worst in the nation for disparities in education, economics, wealth, and over-incarceration, and all those drivers that we refer to as structural and social determinants of health and well-being. So it's critically important to our organization. It's the most fundamental conversation we can be having in our state right now. And the budget reflects that broadly across many domains, from health to economics, criminal justice reform, and all the pieces that we've referred to thus far. And I'm looking forward to our discussion as we go forward to dig deeper.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Delechia Johnson. I am the pyramid model lead for Milwaukee, and I work for the Wisconsin Infant Mental Health Alliance for Infant Mental Health. And I've been in the field in various capacities in early care and education, starting from volunteer, lead teacher, assistant teacher, director, and primarily a trainer, master trainer in the state of Wisconsin, related to training people, those us who work in early care and education. And so I'm so excited because one of the areas that we really struggle with, and the pandemic has really brought that forth, number one, is our childcare teachers, who are predominantly women of color, who also struggled in the pandemic because they are essential workers. They struggled because they didn't have health care, and they were concerned that, you know, they would succumb to the coronavirus as well. So it was a really huge struggle. We also talked about, we were talking about mental health, and also for young children. A lot of times people don't really see that as, it can't happen to babies. Babies don't have mental health issues, or young children, and they're overwhelmingly expelled from pre-K programs. And so I'm so excited that the budget also puts in provisions for training around social emotional development, as well as coaching for those who will care for our youngest population. So I'm really excited to be part of this panel, and I look forward to our discussions.
Great, thank you so much. So what is one proposal, or two that stands out that we've either talked about here on the panel or in the presentation or not, for having an opportunity to kind of make the most meaningful progress toward eliminating or removing barriers for opportunity for communities of color in Wisconsin? We can just, whoever wants to go first, just jump in.
Well, I'm such a politician, I'm ready. I'll jump in quick and let you know, and I've already mentioned it, but if I can give you a little bit of context.
Please do.
Around the piece of policy that I've already mentioned, driver's licenses for undocumented Wisconsinites. This is a piece, and just so the audience knows, I am an alderwoman here in the city of Milwaukee currently, but I did serve previously in the state legislature as a Wisconsin state representative for the near south side of the city of Milwaukee. Driver's licenses for undocumented Wisconsinites was a centerpiece from my legislative career, something that I advocated for a decade. And before me, my predecessor, who is now Judge Pedro Colon, a Milwaukee County Circuit Court judge, we never saw this piece of policy passed, unfortunately. But my last term in the legislature, which would have been last legislative session, Governor Evers, again, in an unprecedented move, was the first Wisconsin governor to put driver's licenses for undocumented Wisconsinites into his budget proposal. And I don't think enough people ever knew that. And the reason that is because, unfortunately, the Republican-controlled state legislature, the Assembly and the State Senate, throughout the governor's budget. They removed driver's licenses for undocumented Wisconsinites from the budget, unfortunately. And because of that, I think a lot of my constituents, they never got the information that we have a governor who did this historic move and tried to give driver's licenses to undocumented Wisconsinites. This is a beautiful thing. It's an important thing. It's progressive policy. It increases the safety of all Wisconsinites, frankly. It increases more folks with automobile insurance. And the fact that we have a governor who has again put this piece of policy in his budget, and he can take political hits, frankly, on this from conservative folks on the right, but he did it because he knows what it means to stand with Black and brown Wisconsinites, to stand with immigrant Wisconsinites who frankly have built this state for generations. And so I just wanted to thank Kids Forward again for hosting this event and talking about the governor's budget, Governor Evers' budget. Whatever may happen to it in a Republican-controlled state legislature is progressive and forward-thinking, and it speaks to the need for racial equity and dialogue and discussion and moving the ball forward finally. So again, thank you, and I'll pass it on to one of my colleagues on the panel.
Yeah, I'll jump in here and say that, like we said initially, all the policies are so critically important, and what's most recognizable by this budget is its holistic character and looking broadly across all the drivers that impact family and community stability, from health to economics to education. We can't look at those pieces in silos. We've done that for so many years and not seen the interconnectedness of the need to simultaneously invest in policies that are working to close gaps on every level and facet of activity that impact families. On the healthcare end, which is to me most critical, because without healthcare access, without access to quality, unbiased care, timely care when we need it for folks across every income level, especially folks of low income, we're talking about lives being at stake. And we've had too long of a track record in our state where folks struggle to access care. Those on the lowest realms of the income spectrum struggling to access care. And that translates to people dying young, dying unnecessarily from chronic illness. And that is a part of what we track. We know that our chronic illness rates, our death rates, our life expectancy rates in the state of Wisconsin look very differently based on race, income, and zip code because of access to care barriers, bias in care. So the full expansion of Medicaid and Badger Care, expanding Badger Care to put 91,000 more adults onto the rolls of healthcare access, looking at our healthcare marketplace, looking to root that as a state-led system versus a federally led system to put more Wisconsinites on care and make it more affordable. Those pieces are crucial and critical, as well as viewing these issues and efforts around health equity from a social and structural determinants of health lens, and embedding those equity officers across all agencies in our state. One particular piece of the healthcare budget that we're most excited about and watching and advocating for is the Healthy Women, Healthy Babies portion of the budget. Our Black infant mortality and maternal mortality rates in Wisconsin are past the state of emergency, and this predated COVID. For years now, since we've been tracking data, disaggregating data by race, and that's been at least for the last 30 years, we've seen major birth disparities between Black mothers and other mothers, and that's translating to Black babies in Wisconsin dying at 3 times higher a rate than white babies. And in Dane County, it's 2 times higher. And we have a 5 times higher maternal mortality rate in the state of Wisconsin for Black mothers. That's unacceptable. No budget prior to Governor Evers' budget this term and in his previous term that didn't pass in our legislature has named Black maternal and child health as a matter of urgency, like these budgets do. And there are specific allocations totaling $30 million to support various initiatives to drive better outcomes in Black maternal and child health. That includes $1 million to expand doulas across Wisconsin and to pay them through Medicaid dollars, to expand postpartum Medicaid coverage to 1 year beyond 6 months, because we know mothers and babies still need support and access to care beyond the immediacy of birth. And we know that's crucial for the mother's health as well as the baby's health, because complications around birthing usually happen after the baby is born, right? When the coverage is disappearing. $3 million in grants to organizations working to address maternal and child health across communities, and these would be community-based efforts, which is very exciting because in Wisconsin, it has been Black women, brown women, Indigenous women who've been driving the solutions in their communities, who've been driving the training around doulas, who've been working to expand the possibility of creating more midwives of color, who've been demanding from their local, county, and statewide governments that Black maternal and child health be raised to a level of priority. So those grant dollars that would be administered through DHS are very important. $4.5 million will be set aside to support Black women-led organizations that are already leading work around Black women's health in our state. That's an unprecedented statement for an administration to say we acknowledge the strength, the power, and the work of Black women who are driving change. And we will invest in that infrastructure to facilitate those efforts that have already been underway. And there's another $300K for a women's health block grant and removing restrictions from Title X so that women have access to safe and legal abortion. So there's a lot in this budget, but that healthy mothers, healthy babies piece is crucial. We need that. Without that, we will continue to rest in a place where disparities will be the narrative for Wisconsin. It has real consequences for people's lives.
I would like to kind of piggyback on that. When you think about early care and education, all of that is where the seed starts for all of the kinds of things that we're talking about in the budget, our very youngest children. And so one of the things that I'm here to really talk about, and the focus of the budget is really the social emotional health of our youngest children. Not only our children, but the people who provide the care for the children. Because there is at least 48% of the parents who have children at the age of 3 think those children should be able to regulate their emotional behaviors, and developmentally, they are not able to do that. And so we want to really provide training and support to help people understand the importance of healthy relationships with young children. That also relates to the people who care for the youngest, who holds the ones that hold the littlest ones. And so providing training and education around social emotional healthy development for the adults, because children really reflect the social emotional bath that they get from their families and from their community. And so we want to make sure that children are healthy, that it also reduces challenge behavior. So children, preschool children are 5 times likely to be expelled from their programs than K-12. So what does that mean? By the time they get to school, they've already had a record. They've already had a record. So when you talk about juvenile justice and inequities, a lot of those, and the boys of color are 5 times more likely to be exposed. And so if you talk about the pipeline to prison, it starts when before they even get to school. So we want to make sure that we're providing healthy communities for children around mental health initiatives, and providing training and coaching for those who care for our youngest. The other component of that is really looking at livable wages for those who work in early care and education. We talk about quality access to quality care. Well, if people don't have the funds and the means to stay there, we lose some of our best teachers. And so we have to find a way to provide a healthy wage. So the reward system will provide some of that support, but we really have to look at those who are caring our youngest. When you talk about health care, because they don't make a livable wage, they cannot afford health care. And so most childcare providers are small businesses, and so they can't afford to provide health care. So if you increase access and for those who qualify, that will help support those who work with our youngest children. So it is important that we really think about our health our mental health of our youngest children and the mental health of those who work with the children. And so having livable wages is totally important. And so mental health is one of those things that most people overlook. When you think about even caring for, that's why we're called early care and education. We're getting to the education, but the care part we're missing, which is the social emotional development. And so we have to understand that the adults are those who help to co-regulate our youngest children. And so if they don't have healthy regulatory skills because they're suffering from trauma, then they will pass that on to the children, their children, and the children that they're serving. So we're really excited about the opportunity to put some real backing behind social emotional development and coaching for those who care for our youngest children.
Great, thank you all so much. So definitely a strong kind of holistic social and structural approach. And Lisa, thank you for pointing out sort of the error in my question, and asking you to choose one thing. No, it's the whole thing, and we have to look at it holistically. I appreciate that. Lisa, can you say a little more? I don't know if people on the webinar know a lot about doulas and how important they are for health and what they have to offer. Can you say a little more about that, please?
Yes, doulas are trained professionals who support women and families, entire families, through the entire perinatal journey, from conception to the length of pregnancy to postnatal, walking with them as educators, support persons, navigators, helping them understand their healthcare journey, helping them troubleshoot questions or experiences they're having as pregnant persons, and really translating things that they may be hearing from their doctor or clinical setting, and providing that continuous ongoing support from beginning to end and after pregnancy that doctors, physicians, and clinics can't provide. We know that doulas have become an essential part of the perinatal journey of women, and thankfully nationally and statewide, our policymakers and decision makers are beginning to understand how pivotal that role is in the healthcare delivery process for pregnant women, particularly women of color who in our state, as we've stated continuously already, face disparate birth outcomes for a host of factors which are tied to all the social economic barriers that we've continued to mention. There are a growing legion of doulas in our state, and we know that that's a best practice policy, not only based on what we're seeing in Wisconsin about the impact doulas are having in better birth outcomes for mothers. There's data, early data from other states and developing data in Wisconsin that show that women and families who have access and support from a doula throughout their pregnancy, even if it was halfway through the pregnancy and not necessarily at the beginning, experience fewer complications throughout their pregnancy, fewer complications in their births, and definitely fewer tragedies or losses of babies in delivery and after birth. So there's evidence that shows that whatever the drivers are, the multitude of drivers, which involve access to care, access to unbiased care, we cannot forget or underscore more enough the issue of healthcare bias. It's a growing body of evidence and work that who your physician is and how closely he or she is or is not looking at you, or understanding your health journey, or asking the right questions, or probing deeply to understand what pre-existing risks you're bringing in, who's screening you, and digging into your family history and providing timely response to treatment, particularly for higher risk pregnancies. Those pieces are really shaped by intercultural bias so often in the healthcare delivery process. Doulas help mitigate that in the meantime, as we're working within systems to drive more cultural competence. Doulas come in. And we're talking about not every doula, all doulas, but African-American doulas, Indigenous doulas, Latinx doulas. We need broad representation that reflects the patients, the mothers, the parenting persons in our state. they really make a difference. And so it's been very important for our organization and others to advocate for the expansion of doulas as a critical part of the healthcare delivery process in the maternal child health pipeline, and to find ways to compensate them for the professional work that they do as trained birth workers. And we are so happy to see that provisions have been placed. This has been multiple years of work to convince decision makers to look at compensation models for doulas that enable them to do this work. Because most doulas in our state are persons who have their own families. It's not their only job because it doesn't pay enough to be their only job. So they may have a day job and this is something else that they're doing. That's not a sustainable model. So looking at proper compensation to fill in these critical gaps that our healthcare systems have not solved. You know, they have not solved this. We also know culturally within the traditions of families, especially persons of color and indigenous cultures, this has always been a part of how we have managed birth and support to mothers and families throughout history. And we're really just raising that up to a new status in a time where we need that more than ever. And doulas and midwives play that critical role, and we've recognized that they're indispensable in the healthcare delivery process. So we're pushing to have payment models and the legitimization of doulas in our healthcare delivery process, and this budget attempts to do that.
Great, thank you so much for that context. So I think Delechia and Lisa, I think you've answered this a little bit, but feel free to go into it more if you'd like. And JoCasta, if you wouldn't mind going first, speak a little bit about the stakes for what's at risk if these investments don't happen, if driver's licenses for all is something that again is sort of dropped from the budget like it was in the last session. If there isn't some tuition equity, what's at stake here?
Yes, that's a great question. We lose a lot if we don't see Governor Evers' budget advance. There's the investment that he's made. We know now, many of us have heard about marijuana legalization. Tony put it in his budget, and he's got plans for that revenue that could come from marijuana legalization. That community reinvestment fund is what he calls it, if I'm not mistaken, where he wants to take the revenue from marijuana legalization to invest it back into the community, to invest it into grants that are going to serve underrepresented Wisconsinites, low-income Wisconsinites, Black and Brown Wisconsinites. And so if we see a budget fail, if we see the Republican-controlled state legislature throw Tony's budget out, we lose that access to that revenue that will positively affect all Wisconsinites. And we lose the potential of policy like that, what you just mentioned, William, and that in-state tuition equity, as we call it, for Wisconsin Dreamers, for qualifying undocumented Wisconsin students to simply not go to college for free, unfortunately, but rather to simply be able to pay that in-state tuition rate at our UW schools and tech colleges that makes higher education a bit more affordable, as you know, because the out-of-state tuition levels can be definitely put higher ed out of reach. We need to make sure that we offer tuition equity to our Wisconsin Dreamers. They went to school here. They graduated from high school here. They live here. Let them achieve the American dream, if you will, and obtain that higher education at their very own UW and Wisconsin Tech colleges. And so we lose a lot. And I'm so glad Ms. Johnson mentioned the childcare component of the state budget. Oftentimes as an elected running for office, I knock on doors in my district on the near south side of Milwaukee, and I can't tell you how many immigrant women, Spanish preference women of color who I met who operate their own or work at a childcare, which is essentially a small business. They are taking care of our workers' children. of our workers' families so that they can go to work, you know, and raise their family here in Wisconsin. And we hadn't looked at our investment in childcare. And I don't know how long. I think one of your colleagues said that it's the most substantial investment in childcare ever, or certainly in a very long time in Wisconsin. We needed to look at that, and we finally have with this budget with Governor Tony Evers. Finally, an investment in childcare, which is, some might argue, I'm sure Ms. Johnson would argue, is the most important time in our children's lives, that very early childhood education, that early childhood experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Johnson, anything to add? You got name checked a couple times.
Absolutely. I think we forget where children start. They don't start when they go to school. It starts prior to that. It starts in the womb. And so if we don't have healthy wombs, if we don't have mothers who are socially and emotionally together, the children come out in a disadvantage. And so we really have to make sure that we bring that back to the forefront, that we see that early childcare is essential. Childcare is essential. A lot of people in this pandemic wouldn't have been able to go to work had it not been for the early care and education field, and yet they still are not acknowledged, right? So everyone else has been acknowledged, but they're still pressing on. When we talk about even having access to the COVID vaccination, they're still kind of floating around in there, right? So again, it's that whole inequity, thinking about challenging behaviors, that implicit bias comes into there, providing some social emotional support for those children who may have challenging behaviors, understanding that trauma, you know, traumatized people traumatize sometimes other people. And it's not a choice, but it's just something that's just happens. And so we have to make sure that we don't create a pipeline to prison, which is really making sure that we provide mental health resources for young children. You mentioned it around the juvenile justice system. A lot of those children were young at one point and are very young. And so if we don't help them to master and regulate and handle some of the challenges and traumas that they've gone through and acknowledge those things and those implicit biases that cause children by the time they get to school not want to go, right? So we want to make sure that we are being able to provide some of those services for our very young ones. So it's really about prevention. It's not about intervention. I think we often think of intervention in the deficit model. Our children have skills and things that they have, but they need someone to help regulate those, help support them, so they then in themselves see that they can do it, that they can be persistent even in the face of adversity. And so we want to make sure that, you know, for the first time in a long time, that early care and education has been put on the map. And we just have to make sure that it stays there, because even like I said, in this pandemic, they started and then they kind of disappeared. And so we want to hold those who hold our youngest and give them the supports that they need.
Thank you. Ms. Peyton-Caire, anything to add about the stakes?
We are dealing with the highest stakes we can imagine. And I started listing them here on my little piece of paper, that substantial number of Wisconsinites will continue to not have access to the care they need, which means their lives will be at risk. This is life or death that we're talking about, particularly for communities of color. And we see it in the data. We don't need to substantiate it anymore. It's clear. Black mothers will continue to be at risk when they have babies. Black babies will continue to be at risk. Indigenous babies, Latinx babies, babies born to poor white women and families will continue to be at risk. We're talking about everyone in our state who finds themselves in a position of disadvantage, even those who may have been in a great position before. COVID-19 has destabilized a massive number of families across the board in our state, and folks who didn't previously find themselves in positions of duress and distress are finding themselves in those places. So we're talking about every Wisconsinite, not just communities of color, but particularly communities of color when we talk about the worst consequences. But we're all in this together right now. We have always been. We're talking about family systems that will continue to be stressed, and something that JoCasta and Delechia both mentioned, which is very important to pull out. Though we are advocating for Black women, Black mothers, mothers who are healthy or having healthy babies, when we talk about women and mothers, we're talking about men and fathers as well. We're talking about family systems. And when we look at Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities and our track record, of racial inequity in this state. When women and men can't get living wage work, when mothers and fathers are dealing with triple the rates of unemployment, underemployment, underinsured, uninsured, we're setting them on a path for a persistent, unmitigated trajectory of inequality, instability that continues to drive Wisconsin's first and worst position for racial equity in the nation. That should disturb our state. It should embarrass our state to be consistently ranked highest or among the highest in the world or the country for healthcare quality, for innovation, for tech expansion, except for Black and Brown people. When we see these gaps in life expectancy, where Black and Brown and Indigenous people live less long than others, by no other reason except racial inequality, because all the other structures in place work for some people but don't work for others. It's glaring and it's blatant. If we don't make these investments in education and early childhood education, we'll continue to lead the nation with the highest educational achievement gaps, which we've been writing and chronicling now for 30 years. And Kids Forward, you put it all on the books in the Race to Equity report, which is probably almost a decade old now. We've been talking about these same patterns, these same realities. We will persist to exist in that pattern of disparity if this budget is not passed. And to me, that's not the Wisconsin that we would want or should want to be. And we need our legislators on each side of the aisle to understand and ask the question, what kind of state do we want to be moving forward in this time where we have an opportunity to be innovative and aspirational and ambitious as this budget attempts to do?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this should be unacceptable to everyone. You know, I remember hearing people talk about how unacceptable, you know, the opioid epidemic is, you know, and we need to have this should be unacceptable as well for everyone, and it shouldn't be a partisan issue. So we have a couple questions from the Q&A. This one is for you, Delechia, specifically asking about advocating for on-site therapists or aides for ECE population. I think this is asking about those opportunities for on-site help for kids. If I'm getting the question right, it sounds like there's a fair amount of support for training of staff. But you know, what is needed for providing support directly to early childhood kids?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. I think we need to have resources in our community that help support with mental health at this young age, other than, like I said, intervention, but more so, how do we provide coaching and technical consulting around challenging behaviors or social emotional? It's really about social emotional. We tend to always say challenging behaviors, but challenging behaviors can look different for everyone. Like crying might be difficult for me, but not difficult for someone else. So it is very culturally based in terms of our expectations of young children. And so it's really about providing training around what that looks like developmentally, what's appropriate for young children in their emotional ability to regulate their emotions and their feelings and their problem solving skills. But it's also critical that we understand that we as adults need help with that as well. If you look at how our society is going, we don't have very good social emotional regulation skills either, right? We don't have good impulse control. You know, we're running lights, we're doing things where we're you know, not thinking before we get into confrontations with other people. We just kind of do it and then think about it. And so when you think about providing training in technical consulting, it's not just about that cognitive or that intellect. So reading and writing, you can't even get to reading and writing if you don't deal with handling emotions. And so most children do not get kicked out of school because they can't read or write. As a matter of fact, people are actually passing school and not have the ability to read or write. It's their regulation skills, their social emotional skills, their social skills that's getting them expelled from school. And so part of the governor's piece and part of what we do at it, We Aim, is really looking at infant mental health and providing training and coaching around how to support young children when they're experiencing challenging behaviors, and providing training such as the pyramid model that actually helps teach children or teach adults how to support children in developing skills to regulate their emotions and their impulses. And so that's really how we can support. So we can provide that additional training in coaching around infant mental health, and start to see our littlest ones, because that's really where the inequities come from, you know. So some of it is culturally based. So for example, boys shouldn't cry. And so oftentimes boys are taught to toughen it up, but those emotions have to go somewhere else. And typically it comes out in a physical form. It doesn't come out in tears, it comes out in anger. And so we also have to know that anger is one of our emotions. It's not necessarily that you're angry, it's what you do with that anger, right? And so that's really how we help support the young ones. And so if we can find funding to provide additional resources around coaching around mental health and challenging behaviors, I think that's how we will mitigate a lot of our children being expelled from early childhood programs.
Okay, thank you. So I think we have about 15 minutes left. So I'd like to ask our kind of last question, which is taking a step away from the budget a little bit. So even the most ideal budget won't lead to equity. And I think that's not going to be a surprise to anybody who's tuning in. What else needs to happen? You know, what needs to happen beyond the budget, given our conversation today, to address systemic racism based in white supremacy? Just a really simple question to end the webinar.
Well, I would say, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, we need to really talk about it. Like even in early care and education, people are afraid to talk about it, to address it, to understand what implicit bias is, to understand people don't want to know that they're racist, right? And so they spend a lot of time trying to fight it versus saying, okay, let's lean into it and say, what does that really mean? What does that really look like? And it's not just, it's gender biases, it's cultural biases, it's all of those things. And it starts with our youngest children, because we always say, do as I say, not as I do. But what they're doing is they're doing what you do. And so if you are name calling, if you're poking fun, if you are downplaying how a child feels or what they experience, because children recognize everything. They've been watching since they've been born. And so we have to have those conversations with our littlest ones. We have to have conversations in training around implicit bias, so that we can recognize it, so that we don't continue to perpetuate it. And I think that's really the challenge. We don't want to talk about it, but you have to talk about it because it impacts us every day. And so we have to make sure that we find people who are allies. We have people to have compassion around those of us that are experiencing implicit biases and microaggressions. And so it's really leaning into being trained around implicit bias.
Yes, piggybacking on what Delechia said, I think this is a prime opportunity to take full use of this awakening, this racial awakening and reckoning that the last year has brought, and that's been magnified by COVID and events around the country and the world, to really build alliances, to understand what our points of agreement are and what our collective priorities should be, and to really mobilize folks who already get it, right? Mobilizing the engines of people who are organizing to push equity. We're having this conversation today, and the state budget that our governor and his team has set forth developed because this has been in the works for some time. You know, this is not something that happened yesterday. This is not something that just came to be coincidentally. This is from the work and the pressure of the people of Wisconsin, who understand that racial equity is one of the biggest questions and issues and unresolved problems our state faces. And that push and that relentlessness in fighting for that to be recognized has brought us to this place that we're at today. So people allying ourselves across lines of race and gender and income and issue and party line is really vitally important right now if we want to create something new. Our public and our private sector can drive massive change. We're seeing that in Dane County with alliances that our organization has with our healthcare systems and our philanthropy community, initiatives that are being pushed by what we call the Dane County Health Council, along with the foundation and other Black women-led entities and ally organizations who are saying that our poor birth outcomes in Dane County are unacceptable. And therefore, we're going to join forces to drive change that is being funded through private dollars primarily to demonstrate and show how this can happen. And that type of activity takes courage for institutions and systems to step outside of the status quo to say, we're going to work with community in new ways. And then as it begins to succeed, it pushes and forces our larger systems to have to adapt. And so I think pressure from the outside and pressure from the inside are the places where we need to put our attention in building these alliances, these public, private, community, innovative alliances, and to continue the grassroots work that pressure our state governments and our systems and decision makers to recognize that they can't ignore the voices and the will of people who want racial, social, and economic equity now.
Yeah, this is the toughest question, and I remember reviewing the questions that you sent us ahead of the panel, and this was definitely the one I was probably least excited to answer because it is a difficult question, and I think my colleagues have done already such a great job speaking to it, especially Lisa, you just called this dialogue that has happened, this racial justice and racial equity awakening and reckoning is exactly, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's exactly what we're living through right now. And I remember first getting elected in 2010 to the state assembly. And I was speaking with somebody and I mentioned white privilege. And I remember that they said, you know, they kind of hushed me like, keep it down. You'll upset people if you say that. And I remember that it wasn't a dialogue that could happen readily within the state legislature, within the state capitol. It was very difficult to broach these topics. And now we're seeing them broached on this national scale, pushed by some of our youngest advocates and activists in the country. And sometimes it's uncomfortable for me, even as a woman of color, as a queer woman of color, who has been in elected office and tried to push the ball in a slower way within the walls of state government, to now have our activists pushing harder, even harder. And I think it is a good thing. It is a difficult thing, but like Ms. Johnson said, we have to talk, we have to dialogue about it. And it exists. We don't have the equity and inclusion that we need. That white privilege does exist. You know, the county executive of Milwaukee, David Crowley, just expanded what he calls the zip code vaccination program in Milwaukee County to get more shots in the arms of Black and brown Milwaukeeans. And he's absolutely right. As of last week, 150,000 white Milwaukeeans across the county have gotten their COVID shot, compared to 25,000 Black Milwaukeeans and 14,000 Latino or Latinx Milwaukeeans. 25,000 Black Milwaukeeans, 14,000 Latinx Milwaukeeans, in comparison to 150,000 of our white counterparts. This proves that there's not the equity that needs to exist in our great state, and we have to have those difficult conversations, and we have to have progressive budgets like Governor Evers' budget, which is a step forward to foster the creation of equity, even though you're absolutely right, William, that it's not the end all be all, and there's still so much more work to do.
And I would just add that equity has become this popular word. I think we have to not just say it, we have to do it. And so please don't use it as a trend. Don't say, oh, this is a great thing to do, let's just jump on it. But really it's about the action. It's really an action word. It really means to really do the hard work that's needed to be done. Because other way, you do the same thing, you get the same results. And so we're showing that right now. Our state is really showing that, that we're still doing it. We're still redlining. We're still doing all those things. We know exactly where the red lines are, but nobody's doing anything about it. So that just says, hey, we promote inequities. And so we really have to lean into that work. We really have to, that's why it starts with our youngest. Our youngest are starting to lead us in this change, and they don't necessarily have all of the baggage that we carry in our generations. And so they're really going into it with open eyes. So we really need to understand what equity means. It doesn't mean fair in the way that we think about being fair, but really giving people what they need. It's sort of like treat people how you want to be treated, but you really should treat people how they need to be treated. And so we really need to think about really not, again, I don't like when people use equity and then don't do anything with it. So we really, those of you that are listening, you got to lean into it. You got to be allies. We got to do it across sectors, right? It's not about your pot, my pot, that pot. It's about our whole pot, because without all of this, we all suffer.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Yes, equity is a verb. I think somebody said that in the chat. I like that. You know, and just an example, you all have talked about the years of work that has been done before that underpins and scaffolds this budget. And so, you know, clearly there is lots of work that's been done, lots of work that needs to be done. And I'm getting the hook. So thank you so much for all of your work. Thank you so much for the work that you're going to do for years to come. And thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. It was wonderful. So thank you so much. Michelle, I will pass it back to you for a quick closing.
There we go, John. I did it too. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, William. And in the tradition of my Southern family and my Cubana family, Señorita JoCasta, Miss Delechia, and Miss Lisa, thank you so much for the inspiration. You all gave us so much to think about, be inspired to act, to do the hard work, as Miss Delechia said. And thank you for reminding us that we are all in this together. And most critically, for everyone listening and participating today, that this budget is the result of the work and the pressure of people, of us. Miss Lisa told me many times via email, I'm not a policy person. And you heard her, I'm going to take her on the road with me. She is a policy person. And so we are all policy people. We are all budget people, because that's what it's going to take. And so before we close out, I'm going to do this. My mother's New Yorker, so she talks really fast. So I'm going to talk real fast, and hopefully you catch a little bit of what you can do to help out. And so to learn more about the possibilities for a new Reimagined Wisconsin, we at Kids Forward have a site called reimagine.org. It tells the story of what's possible. So we invite you to visit that. We will also have a white paper on equity in the budget in a few weeks. And our Race to Equity team will release a Kids Count report highlighting some of the data points I talked about, but it is about the pandemic pain points. And so for Wisconsin's children and families, and it shows the disaggregated experience of folks of color. Then you can also find most of our reports at our websites, and my teammates are now placing a bunch of links in the chat for you all. And we have another set of webinars that have been going on, but the last two are coming up, and they are on the juvenile justice reform. So we are part of a coalition. We're housing it at Kids Forward called Youth Justice Wisconsin. And it is an effort to reform, finally, our very archaic juvenile justice system. And we will have a webinar on March 25th that will focus on disparity in the system. And Erica Nelson, who you saw earlier, will be leading that webinar. Finally, it is, and most importantly, as we have all mentioned, it is important to share your voice. There's a link being placed in the chat that has the governors and the Joint Finance Committee's hearing schedules. I know many of us often, until we get into this kind of work, don't think of ourselves going to the Capitol and letting our voice be heard, or going to a hearing and letting our voice be heard, but that is so very important. We saw in the last biennium that the budget just got sort of shuffled through, right? And many of things, probably all of the things that many of us care about, were not included. And what was helpful was to be able to show how many Wisconsinites came out and opposed the fact that all of that was going to happen, right? And so we need your voice. We need to hear from you. And there's a link that tells you how to show up. And a whole bunch of advocates fought for virtual opportunities for people to testify. And so that has not been the case through most of the pandemic, and we are happy that that will be the case for the budget. And then if you sign up for Kids Forward and Wisconsin Budget Project newsletters, you'll get more information about how you can speak up for kids of color and those furthest from opportunity. Finally, in my last minute, I just want to say thank you. On behalf of John, Dadit, Erica, Tamarine, and myself, thank you so much for spending this time with us. For our children and families, let's keep pressing on, as Ms. Delechia said, and let's get the governor the support he needs around this unprecedented budget. Thank you so much. Enjoy your spring, stay healthy, and we'll see you out there.